Hi, my name is Rachel. I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of Bristol. Today, I'm presenting work I did with Paul Marshall, Graham Stuart, and Ashleen O'Kane at the University of Bristol. This work is about the complex journey from self-tracking with wearables to diagnosis. Technological advances in self-tracking tools mean they've gone far beyond their original capability of counting steps. Today, consumers can effortlessly collect increasingly complex physiological data. This data potentially offers users the capability to gain deeper insights into specific areas of their health. Coupled with the regulatory approval of some wearables to detect the abnormal heart rhythm, atrial fibrillation, means that consumers can now access data via their wearable that was once only available in a clinical setting. Arrhythmia screening has thus transitioned from a physician-led in-clinic process to a consumer-led at-home approach. Atrial fibrillation, whilst not immediately life-threatening, significantly increases the risk of stroke and heart failure. Its diagnosis is challenging, as a third of patients show no signs of symptoms and 20% are only diagnosed after suffering a stroke. Strokes due to AF tend to be much more severe, leading to greater disability and mortality. Utilizing widely available technology could address the diagnostic challenges for atrial fibrillation. However, very little is known about the lived experience of individuals who have successfully used self-tracking tools to support a cardiac diagnosis. We sought to better understand what motivated these individuals to engage in self-tracking of cardiac health data, and what self-tracking practices are adopted by these individuals to support a cardiac diagnosis. To answer these questions, we conducted an analysis of posts from an online community, exploring first-person accounts of self-tracking's assisted cardiac diagnosis. We then conducted 15 follow-up interviews. The interviews were semi-structured, with 8 participants self-declaring a diagnosis of atrial fibrillation. The remaining participants actually had other cardiac conditions such as heart failure and valvular heart disease. We took an inductive bottom-up approach to data analysis following Braun and Clark's thematic analysis method. We identified 3 main motivations for self-tracking cardiac data: validating body signals, gathering evidence, and responding to system-generated alerts. Symptomatic participants use self-tracking to validate their bodily experiences, finding reassurance in track data that their symptoms were real, not just caused by anxiety, stress, or imagination. This validation made their experiences feel tangible, encouraging them to take action. Participants also used self-tracking to gather evidence for medical consultations. This was especially useful for those with atypical or infrequent symptoms, since no non-invasive clinical heart rhythm monitor can capture ECGs for longer than 14 days. The hospital-issued monitors are not always convenient. Participants often chose smartwatches as a practical alternative. One participant encapsulated this sentiment, comparing the accessibility of a smartwatch for recording ECGs to having a camera ready at a crucial moment. For mostly asymptomatic participants, alerts from their devices were a critical prompt to actively engage in tracking, often marking a shift from passive to active tracking. We found that understanding of self-collected data was often incomplete, requiring complex collaborative sense-making and action phases. For many, data shaped engagement with medical professionals, helping some users to question a lack of diagnosis. As the diagnostic process is not always immediate, We also documented how participants continued to self-track during the sometimes long diagnostic process. I will discuss two of these findings in more detail now. Participants face challenges in understanding their self-collected data. While some developed systematic strategies comparing measurements across various tracking tools and looking for visual patterns, others relied very heavily on family members who were in the medical field or their private cardiologists for interpretation, an option not available to all users. For some, subjective experiences unlocked understanding. We had one participant who came to understand their high recovery scores on their fitness tracker aligned with the days their symptoms were more severe. And so a high score became a sign of concern to this participant. This participant's interpretation completely contraindicated what the score was intended to indicate. Particularly for those receiving alerts, understanding their cardiac data was an evolving process. These participants often passively tracked and struggled to distinguish between normal and abnormal data. The lack of familiarity led to an unintended cycle of continuous data collection, sometimes using multiple tools to confirm the accuracy of alerts before seeking medical advice. Despite alerts typically advising medical consultation, participants seldom followed this advice due to a lack of understanding and trust. Ultimately, making sense of self-collected data often required collaborative efforts with medical professionals. Diagnosis, particularly for conditions like atrial fibrillation, is not a static one-off event, but a very dynamic, ongoing process. This is due to the fluctuating nature of the condition, with the abnormal rhythm coming and going. We find that participants with atrial fibrillation continued to heavily rely on alerts and often upgraded self-tracking tools to access more passive monitoring due to fear of the condition reoccurring. Other participants faced prolonged diagnostic periods as they were dealing with complex heart conditions like valvular heart disease and heart failure. These conditions often require a myriad of tests to confirm diagnosis, and participants find themselves caught in no man's land. They knew they had a cardiac condition, but were very uncertain about the causes, the treatment, and how serious the condition was. In this scenario, alerts held value to these participants, but they also evoked helplessness, as participants alone could not act on this self-collected data, often because they could not easily access specialist care. Based on this work, we present design implications for how wearables may be designed to support appropriate medical engagement. Wearables are being used by some consumers to bridge gaps in clinical diagnostic modalities. Wearable data is being used as a form of evidence. We recommend that data visualizations must be clinically credible and cater to specific clinical contexts, with careful consideration for designing with the gatekeepers to care in mind, such as emergency physicians and general practitioners, who may need more support in interpreting single-lead ECGs. Alerts were very important for asymptomatic participants, particularly for those with the condition atrial fibrillation. Users need more guidance on conditions that may have no overt symptoms. For these participants, alerts became very confusing. Increasing alert frequency may prompt clinical engagement. However, increasing frequency of alerts post-diagnosis or during that diagnosis period, which can be long, risks causing very negative consequences. In our research, we've highlighted how self-tracking tools can aid cardiac diagnosis. We do not wish to overstate the self-tracking technology capabilities. We believe these successful experiences are currently very rare. Our findings point to several areas for future research. Investigating unsuccessful experiences is really important. With increasing access to this complex data, it's crucial to understand the impact of false positives and how misunderstanding this data may lead to unnecessary health anxiety and misuse of medical resources. Whilst we find health alerts effectively draw users' attention to their data and health and encourage them to collect more data, further research is needed to design alerts that encourage timely medical consultation rather than prolonged data collection periods. Considering the extended wait times for accessing specialist care, for instance, in the UK, it currently may take up to 18 months to access a cardiologist. It's really important to balance the need for alerts with the risk of causing distress through repetitive messages. Users waiting for specialist care heavily rely on alerts to monitor their health stability or decline. So designing alerts that are helpful over these long diagnostic periods without causing undue stress is a critical challenge. Thank you for listening.